Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first ever session of Giants Weekly, where we learn from giants in the tech and startup universe together every Tuesday. My name is Tip. I'm part of the Blackbird team, and today we're extremely lucky to be learning from Adam Flynn, who helped pivot and grow Wish to one of the most prolific e-commerce platforms in the world. Adam, thank you so much for sailing across the Pacific to be with us here in New Zealand today. That's a true story.
Thanks, Tip.
So Adam will be sharing his insights from his time at Wish and the lessons he learned while finding product market fit that skyrocketed Wish's transaction from $0 to over $1 billion in 3 years. Adam will be running a presentation today, and then we have about 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A. So any questions you have for Adam, just chuck them into the Q&A function in Zoom down below, and make sure you upvote for your favorite ones as well. All right, Adam, over to you for the presentation.
Hey, thanks, Tip. Hey, guys. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about Wish's journey toward finding product market fit and talk about what I think the generalizable lessons from that might be. I like Wish's story of product market fit because I think it's a little different from a lot of the other content out there. I think a lot of stuff you read about product market fit sort of takes the form of these like 2 or 3 magical things came together and then all of a sudden everything worked. Or overnight we launched it, it got crazy traction on Hacker News, and it was just a massive success overnight. Wish was definitely not that at all. It was a product of really 3 years of sort of a hard and disciplined climb to get there. And I think there are a lot of interesting lessons in that. So let's dive in. A little bit of history about Wish. So Wish was started, the company behind Wish was started in 2010. But in the beginning, Wish wasn't even a glimmer in our eye. We didn't expect to be in e-commerce. We didn't think we'd be doing anything like that. We thought we were going to be building ad tech. So the company was sort of, the initial team was a bunch of ad tech-like people, sort of tech and math heavy, not product heavy. We'd worked in big product companies, Google, Yahoo, Facebook, but in always very tech-heavy roles, not product-centric roles. So the first year or so of Wish, or sort of the company, was pivoting from ad tech product to ad tech product. I think we had like half a dozen different products in that first year. And so like every 2 months, the company would be working on a totally different product. I think there was a point where our like half a dozen developers were building 3 different products at the same time. So we'd kind of have the core of an idea for something, build out a prototype, sort of shop it to a few customers, see if the prototype looked like it was coming together. If it looked promising, spend a little more time on it. If it didn't look promising, kill it and move on to something else. We were really, really good at not getting attached to the stuff we were building and just moving on if it seemed like, this just doesn't seem like a good road. So fast forward from 2010 to 2011, the company is about a year in, almost exactly. And then we kind of have the kernel of an idea that became Wish. And that sort of core premise that Wish was built on was that we think if we can build a super engaging consumer experience where people will organically want to interact with specific products and give us feedback on those products by like clicking like or sharing it with their friends or saving it to a list or something like that. If we can get really good data from users about specific products, then we can build a really good product recommendation engine. And then somehow we can monetize that. Maybe we monetize it by selling the data. Maybe we monetize it through like a SaaS thing. Maybe we do sort of e-commerce directly. We didn't really know, but we were pretty sure that if we could own a really, really good product recommendation engine, things would fall into place. And sort of keeping in mind, this was 2011. So these days, I'm going to get a bunch of proprietary data, build a recommendation engine on top of it, and that will somehow be valuable is like a fairly common thing to think about in a world of like all startups are AI startups. Back in 2011, it's not like we were the first people to think of this, but it was much less common. So it was like kind of a bit of a weird idea back then. So cool, we have this core of an idea, and it turned out that that idea was like extremely valuable and extremely correct, but we had no idea how to action that. We knew where we were trying to go, but none of us were really product people. We didn't have this sort of Steve Jobs-esque vision of like, I've seen the future and I know exactly what mobile shopping is going to be in 5 years, and we just need to build that. There was kind of no super great sort of detailed product thesis of like, this is exactly how we're going to bring it into the world. At the time, Pinterest was the super, super hot Silicon Valley company. Their engagement numbers were huge. People just loved this infinite scroll through beautifully designed living rooms and like pinning stuff. And they really loved that experience. But we thought Pinterest's problem was it wasn't specific to products you could go out and buy. It was just this like generically beautiful living room. How do you turn that into a product recommendation? We kind of thought they would struggle with that. And so we were like, okay, well, Pinterest is super popular. They're doing super well. They have roughly the mechanic we want. Let's just clone that. So in 2 furious months of nonstop coding, we built essentially a Pinterest clone and launched it. It turns out it's super easy to clone a popular consumer app. It's super hard to build a really compelling consumer experience. So we launched it and got like 20 users, and I think half of them were like us and our parents. And that launch sort of kicked off what was about a 2-year period of very disciplined experimentation to get to product market fit to really start our growth. It was 2 years of trying out a whole bunch of different things, trying to take risks that were big enough that most of the time our experiments would fail, but if they succeeded, they would succeed in a big way. So we're learning a lot every time. We're not just kind of moving the button around a little bit or picking a slightly different shade of blue to see if we can get a 0.5 percentage point lift. We're trying to make bigger jumps through the product to figure out what is it that users are actually going to want? What is sort of the right combination of stuff here? And it was just a sort of 2-year climb to get there. And it wasn't until we were really, really close that I started to feel like, yep, this is going to work. For most of this period, I thought like, this is a cool experience. I like being here. I'm working with smart people, but come on. I mean, we're never going to, look, we got this like weird Pinterest knockoff that doesn't really make any sense. Like, there's no way this is going to turn into a big business. I'm really glad that I'm working here, but like there's not a, what is it now, like $11 billion business here. And I think that was like a fairly consensus view at the time. And so it's not strange when you're trying to push this boulder uphill to feel like there's no end in sight, because it doesn't really look like things are working until you're almost right on top of them working. And it wasn't, we kind of got to the crest of that hill. There was, maybe a 2-3 month period where we went from sort of pushing this boulder uphill, trying to force the startup to grow a little bit more, to have slightly more engagement, to when the boulder got to the top of the hill and now starts rolling down. And then the game changes from trying to push and push and push to get the metrics to be better to your users want your product faster than you can give it to them. And so you're racing to stay ahead of the momentum of this business. And that's the phase where your business is just constantly on fire. You have problems with hiring, you have problems with culture, you have problems with customer support, you have problems with fraud. Every 2 weeks, there's a new major emergency. It gets harder after you find product market fit, I think. It gets a lot more satisfying, it's a lot more fun, but it definitely doesn't get easier, it just changes. But it was striking how quickly it went from this grind to push uphill to suddenly everything's working super, super well. Now we just need to race to stay ahead of it so that we aren't crushed under the weight of our own business, which, like Tip said, we went from effectively $0 in sales to $1 billion in like 3 years. That's nuts. So that's kind of what we did. Now I'll talk a little bit about what I think the generalizable lessons from that story are. And when I think back, I think the first bucket you could call something like mindset. And probably the most important idea that I have today is this first one, which is to be really, really clear in your thinking between things that you know and things that you merely suspect. I think when you're in the trenches working on a product, it's really, really easy to confuse a strongly held intuition with a fact, and being super, super clear in your own thinking about, I know that this change increases conversion rate on this page because we tested it and it definitely does, from, yeah, I mean, we did some similar things in the past. If we made this change, it's going to work. Being really, really clear about, I know this because I tested it and proved it empirically, from, I strongly suspect this is true from the huge base of experience that I have working with this product, is really powerful. Because if you can be good at being intellectually honest with yourself about what you know and what you don't know, it leads itself naturally to framing things as questions. If you know that this is merely an intuition, then you can reframe it as a question of how would I prove that making this change will in fact increase conversions? What's the cheapest way that I can run an experiment and get that knowledge, and what might that knowledge about whether it's true or false imply about the next thing I should do? So step one is to be super clear in how you think about it. Step two then is to be super clear in how you communicate it. I think if everyone in a company speaks in terms of things that they know versus intuitions, so just like in normal conversations with people in their company, they say not, we should totally make this change, it'll make conversions go up. They say, my intuition is that if we made this change, conversions would go up. And being really, really explicit about using that kind of language, I think, is really helpful to a company's culture because it gets people thinking in the right way. It's not about guessing, it's about empirically testing these things. Another thing sort of in the bucket of mindset that I think a lot of startups can do better on is that iterating quickly is probably one of your most powerful levers to increase your chance of finding product market fit. If you're consistently taking risks and learning from those risks, and the risks are big enough that you're not just going to get stuck in a little local maximum somewhere, then eventually, given infinite time, your probability of finding product market fit trends to 100. Like if you can try infinite random things, eventually you're going to find a thing that works. That just like kind of makes sense. Problem is startups don't have infinite time. Their time is limited either by when the founders give up or when you run out of cash. And so you can kind of frame this problem as, can I do enough random stuff and learn from that random stuff well enough to make better educated random guesses about the future such that I land on the answer before we give up or run out of money? And so when you frame it like that, if you can double the amount of stuff you can try, it's kind of like you double your chances of getting there. And so if a startup says, yeah, we can ship that feature out in a couple days, you should be asking yourself, like, could we ship it out in 4 hours though? Because that would be better. I mean, my job at Wish was running infrastructure. So code quality and robustness and reliability and sort of long-term management of technical debt, all issues that are near and dear to me and that I care about a lot. But I think a lot of pre-product market fit startups care way too much about making either their product or their technology way better than it has to be. If you're taking enough risk, most of your experiments should be failing. And so why would you invest a bunch of time building something that's probably going to fail and you're going to have to delete? It's way better to have a company with awful technology and product market fit than a company with beautiful technology and no cash in the bank, and then it dies and you delete the GitHub account. So you really want to focus on, until you get product market fit, it's almost like tech debt doesn't matter that much. It's a nuanced conversation, but you should have a very strong bias toward get this thing out quickly, because until we find product market fit, the long-term health of this tech stack doesn't matter that much. And then my last point in mindset is don't hesitate to delete failed experiments. In the beginning for us, I mean, we were pivoting around every 2 months to a brand new product. And then even when we had Wish out and we were experimenting there, we were making these big changes and invest a bunch. And for a while, we thought we were going to do like C2C e-commerce. We spent a bunch of time building out all these C2C features. And like 3 months later or 6 months later, we're like, yeah, this is not going to work. And then we had to scrap all of that major effort. And I think that should be okay. You should encourage people in your company and yourself first to be attached to the results of your work, not the actual work product itself. So people should be excited about, we launched this experiment and whether it did well or not, we learned stuff from it. And that will improve our ability to make product decisions in the future. They should be excited if the experiment's positive that I did some work and that work increased engagement. That should be a thing they're excited about. They shouldn't be explicitly excited about, I built this piece of product. And I think there's a natural tendency for people to want to be excited about sort of the immediate result of their work. But culturally, if you can get people to be excited about sort of what are the second order effects of your work? The first order effect is you shipped this bit of code. The second order effect is what did that code do? That's the thing that you should get everyone excited about. Because as a founder, that's what you care about all day long. What is the effect of this stuff? The process is not what you're aiming for, it's the effect. And if you can get everyone in your company to think in that way, then everyone in your company will be thinking like you as a founder and pushing the business forward instead of getting attached to, I built this thing, the results are neutral or like a little bit positive, I don't know, let's double down, let's invest more, maybe it'll be good. You should be saying, no, like if this is not working, let's just kill it and try something new instead of wasting our time chasing after things that may or may not happen. And last, sort of really quickly, I have a little bit of tactical advice. Usually I don't give advice this tactical in sort of a very general talk, but I think these points are important and I don't see enough people emphasizing them. And they're around sort of what are the pieces of infrastructure and the sort of engineering practices you need to actually do this in practice. When I tell people that 2 days after we launched Wish's MVP, the first major technical project we rolled out was an analytics platform, people are surprised by that. It's like right after you launch your MVP, there's still a ton of bugs that you haven't fixed. There are features you want to get out. There are things you want to try. But we stopped and invested a bunch of effort in building this platform for doing analytics and experiments and tracking logs and all that kind of stuff. It's like kind of a weird thing to invest in. But the way we saw it was, if we can't rigorously measure an experiment, then there's no point in launching a feature. Because if we can't measure the effect of the feature, we've learned nothing from the feature. And so the feature like kind of has no value. We're just like tried something random and we have no idea what happened. Even if our intuition is like, this feature is going to be awesome, cool, that doesn't matter until you've actually proven that it was awesome because it moved some metric by some threshold amount. So building stuff without knowing what the effects of what you built are is not that useful. And so we invested in building this piece of technology to do all that for us. These days, there are more open source and SaaS options that I haven't worked with, but I assume are pretty good. You don't have to go build it all yourself, but you probably want to pay more attention to it than what I see a lot of startups do, which is like someone in like 4 hours hacks something together and it's good enough to get like a daily active users graph that you can put in the office somewhere and like, yeah, we have analytics. But over time, that'll degrade. Your needs will become more complicated. No one will really invest in it. It'll become like, I don't want to touch that thing. And if you start hearing people in your company ask, what is, asking a question about the past, something about stuff that happened on your product before, you should always like 100% be able to answer any question about any user activity on your product in the past. It's like it happened in the past. So objectively, like there's no magic to answering this is exactly what happened in my product before, because it already happened. You should be able to capture all that data. But in practice, startups can get to a place where a product manager asks kind of a complicated, nuanced question about some past usage, and then someone comes back and says, oh, we actually don't have the data for that, or we don't have a way to build a query for that, or like, we don't know. If you hear that as a founder, you should start getting really worried that you're not investing enough in this kind of infrastructure. We spend probably 5 to 10% of our engineering resources on an ongoing basis just on analytics, either improving the tooling in general or going out and building very complex tools to go answer nuanced questions from past data. And then on an ongoing basis, this is something that everyone in your company needs to pay attention to. We had normal feature reviews before a feature went out at Wish, but we also had a logging review. And often we spent more time concerned about, is this feature logging everything that we need to know in a way that is correct and consistent with all the questions we might want to ask? What are the questions we might want to ask about this feature? Is all of this being stored and structured in the right way? We often spent more time worried about that than we did worried about, is this call to action right? Or is this button in the right place? Or should we move these things around? Because that stuff you can fix if you have the right data. But if you have the wrong data, you're just running blind. And so it should be that for every single feature, every single engineer is concerned about, what data are we tracking with this feature? What are the questions that we may hypothetically want to ask in the future, and can we answer those questions? If you have those really strong foundations, then all the rest of this becomes possible, and finding product market fit is just a very long climb uphill pushing a boulder. So that's all I've got. Thank you very much, guys. If you're struggling to find product market fit still, keep up the good fight. It's hard, and don't get discouraged by stories that say the startup was an overnight success and everything magically came into a place because of a Steve Jobs-like founder who had a magical insight about the future. It has a lot more to do with a hard and disciplined climb than it does any kind of magic. Thanks, guys.
Love it, Adam. There was so many good nuggets of wisdom there, and I have to rewatch this and write it all down. I particularly love that analogy about finding product market fit is like pushing the boulder up the hill. And Benjamin Kennedy, one of the audience members, has a really good question. He wants you to talk a little bit more about that tipping point. What was it like? How do you know you actually reached product market fit? And were there any kind of factors that you looked at that slowly began building momentum that you didn't see before?
Sure thing. Great question. So for us, it was, because we're in e-commerce, for us, product market fit effectively boils down to meaningfully positive unit economics. So if we can get users engaging with the app enough and buying enough stuff that the revenue we make from selling them stuff is meaningfully higher than the cost of user acquisition, then and only then is it safe to invest a lot in growth. So for us, that tipping point was positive unit economics so that growth marketing makes sense, because e-commerce at scale is fundamentally just a growth marketing game. And so that meant on one side, we need to continue to improve our ad tech to make the cost of user acquisition cheaper. And on the other side, we need to continue to improve our product to have better retention so that we get more repeat purchases and sort of better engagement and better conversion on that first purchase, so that for every user we buy, they have a higher probability of buying something from us and spending more money. So for us, the structure was, it was a unit economics game, and that's how we knew when the cost of user acquisition became meaningfully lower than the revenue per user. I think in every different type of startup, it's a slightly different story. But I think it all kind of, in general, boils down to, can you afford to spend a lot of money growing your business? And can you convince someone else, you really convince yourself, like in a somewhat bulletproof way, that if someone handed me a big pile of money and I spent it all on growth, an even bigger pile of money would show up at the other side. And trying to invest in growth before you've answered that question, which I think is a lot of what product market fit boils down to. Trying to invest in growth before you're confident that on the other side, that growth is actually going to pay off, is a really good way to lose a lot of money very quickly, and has caused a lot of startups to die. So for us, it was kind of watching those metrics. And as we were finding the unit economics were getting positive, we were able to spend more profitably on growth marketing, which was making more users come, which was making sort of all the rest of the network effects of the business kick in, of more consumers mean more merchants, mean better products, mean more consumers. It's sort of marketplace network effects, and also network effects on the data side, being able to build better product recommendations. So all of that kind of came together in this 2 or 3 month period. And it was weird to live through, honestly. I think when people say, if you have product market fit, you'll know, I think they're right.
Awesome. Joel Meredith had an awesome question. He said, thank you. What are the indicators saying you should change market versus indicators you should change products?
So I think the answer to that question comes down to a lot of context and probably a judgment call. You know, as a startup founder, you kind of know your market best, or you ought to know your market best. And I think for decisions like that, being a startup founder or an early leader in a startup is sort of this weird psychological game of flip-flopping between extreme humility, where you're listening to every available signal from the world. You're reading as much stuff as you can. You're talking to your advisors. You're talking to your customers. You're talking to your employees. You're talking to your friends. You're just trying to soak up as much information about the world as you can in a very, very humble way, assuming that the things you're thinking about may well be wrong. And then very, very quickly being able to flip-flop to, now I have an extreme amount of self-confidence that even though there are a lot of people who doubt this decision, this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to stick with it. And you know, it's unreasonable for me to have this level of confidence given the data I have, but I'm going to go do it anyway. And so I think that kind of nuanced judgment and getting really good at listening to what the world is trying to tell you and then converting that into very, very confident action is kind of all you've got. So there are no hard and fast rules. You just have to listen very attentively, make the call, and then stick with it and charge ahead.
Awesome. And you mentioned in the presentation, low risk versus high risk iteration, where low risk was, for example, moving a button around. Can you give us an example of a high risk iteration, what you did at Wish that stood out to you?
Sure. I think a good example from Wish would probably be when we did a big experiment trying to do C2C e-commerce. We thought like local shopping might be a thing. There were a few apps at the time that were becoming popular in that space. And we thought like maybe that's a new growth channel. to try to be this B2C e-commerce, but also have a C2C component, get some more user-generated content. Maybe it's a way to get activity up. We weren't really sure, and we kind of took this very big leap, because taking technology that was designed for B2C e-commerce and then layering on top all the complexity of C2C and managing shipping and managing problems with the product and customer support, figuring out the fee structure, all of that kind of stuff took, in the early days, weeks, maybe a couple months to build, which in those days for us was a huge amount of time for a project to take. And we kind of went all in on this C2C e-commerce thing. And after a few months, it became clear that it's just not working. It's not growing enough. I mean, it's not nothing. It's kind of growing, it's kind of working, but it's just not working enough. So we had to make that very hard judgment call to say, hey, the whole company has been focused on getting this major thing out that was going to be, huge new green fields of growth. And actually, it's just not working that well. So we've got to pull the plug on it.
Awesome. Ju Tong Lee asks, what is the early workload like at Wish? For example, how many people do you have in the team? What were people specializing in? How many hours do you guys work per week just to get that product market fit period?
Sure thing. So the early team, kind of once we launched Wish, there were maybe half a dozen engineers working full time. And for us, that looked like sort of 80 hours a week at a minimum, 100 hours a week when we needed to peak. And in and around, 80 hours a week can be sustainable for long periods of time, although the rest of your life kind of falls away. At 100 hours a week, you don't even have time to do laundry and your life just falls apart. So you can't sustain 100 hours a week for longer than just a few sprints. But 80 hours a week, I would say for the first 3 or 4 years was probably about the average. 6-7 days a week, pretty typical.
Awesome. I'm curious about half the products that you built and you had to bin it. I know you talked about unit economics as well, but what were some of the other factors that you looked at that made you pull the plug? And what were you looking for in those products that it just didn't achieve what you wanted to achieve, and also the time frame that you gave it time to succeed?
Sure. Yeah, we did a bunch of random stuff early on. The first thing that I built at Wish was I was trying to build a clone of Twitter where people would follow topics instead of following people, so that you could reach non-famous experts in topics that you cared about, was roughly the thesis. We kind of had some ML technology early on that could kind of be okay at figuring out what people were talking about and how authoritative they were back in 2010, when not every company just had a bunch of crazy ML stuff. So we tried to build this weird janky Twitter clone that never really worked out. We tried building a few different ad tech products to make display ads on websites more effective. That one, as I recall, didn't work out because it turned out sort of the amount that we could make it better than the status quo of just using Google was not that high. And sort of total addressable market of that, just the economics didn't make any sense because we weren't adding enough value. This was ever going to be a company that made sense. So a lot of it was sort of technical risk. How much can we build and how good will what we build be? And relatively early on, we could get a sense of is this going to work, or is this kind of marginal? And then going out to customers and figuring out how valuable is this actually going to be to some customers? Is it going to be valuable enough that we sort of sense that there's a big opportunity here? Or they're yeah, in the margins, we might want it, but sure, we'll take the extra 5 or 10%, but it doesn't change the game for us. So finding a product that you can find customers that are really desperate for what you're building, instead of yeah, it'd be nice, but I don't need to have it.
Awesome. We have time for one more question. I think a lot of audience members have asked similar questions around this. What are some of the tools that you would recommend them use to maybe measure metrics when they're running experiments? Any interesting ones that might be useful to some early stage founders?
I wish I had a really good answer on this. When we started, a lot of the tools that exist today didn't exist. And I spent the last few years out sailing and not doing infrastructure stuff. So I think if I tried to answer that question, I would probably steer you in the wrong way. But features that you would want to care about in the tools are, can you store arbitrary kinds of data? So we would store when the user was viewing a page that listed all the product, that sort of listed their cart, and they could click buy or sort of move back or whatever. We would log with that request, not just this user ID was viewing their cart. We would log this user ID is viewing their cart, And by the way, here are all the products that were in their cart. And this is when they added those products to their cart, and all kinds of other context about what was going on at the time, so that we could go back and do really interesting analysis of like, is user behavior different if there are more than one item, if there are multiple items in the cart versus one item in the cart, if it's expensive versus cheap, where are they trying to ship it to? Are they trying to ship it to the US or to a different country? What was the shipping cost in their cart at that time? So going way beyond just measuring, this was the request, this was the time, this was the user, and measuring all of the context of what the user experienced when they got that request, gives you a lot more flexibility to go back and be able to ask really nuanced questions and really dive into what was the user behavior, why might that behavior have been that way, and run that let you sort of really optimize. So I would say you need something that's extremely flexible that lets you write sort of complex arbitrary queries, log complex arbitrary things with each request to then go back and get it. For us, we built using a company called Treasure Data, which was essentially like Hive on Hadoop. So it was sort of a general data warehousing system that we built a bunch of queries on top of and then built graphs on top of. I assume there are companies that do that kind of thing today, but I don't know what they are. I'm sorry.
No, that's all good. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Adam, thank you so much for that awesome presentation. All the audience have got so much out of it. And thank you for being the first speaker for Giants Weekly as well. Awesome.
Thanks, Tip. Thanks, guys.
Next Tuesday, we have the unstoppable Rachel Newman, who launched and led Eventbrite in our part of the world. Rachel tells it as it is, and she's got extreme depth and clarity around building product-centric customer-centric products. Sorry about that. So make sure you join Rachel and I next week. Between now and then, you can get your Blackbird fix by checking out our new podcast, Wild Hearts, hosted by my teammate Mason Yates, interviewing the founders of Blackbird portfolio companies. So Mason's interview is with Fleet's CEO, Flavia, which launches today. So make sure you check that out in our socials at Blackbird VC. All right, guys, have an awesome Tuesday, and I'll see you same time next week. And Adam, thank you so much again.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Bye.